Hello! Welcome to A Witch's Yarn, a mystical book club led by your host, Esther Dawn. In this podcast, we explore our questions about the world of witchcraft and paganism through reading and research. Each episode, we read and discuss a multitude of topics, from deity worship to spellcraft. So grab a cozy beverage, get settled in your favorite chair, pick up your craft of choice, and join me as I tell you a witch's yarn. Hello, friends, and welcome to episode 6 of A Witch's Yarn. I am your host, Esther Dawn, and I am so happy to have you back. I want to start by apologizing for my 2-week hiatus. I did not mean for it to be a 2-week hiatus. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I had a lot of things going on, nothing bad. I had my birthday, I was visiting parents, I had to make an emergency trip to my parents one weekend, and then I went as scheduled the next weekend. There was just a lot of stuff going on, so I wasn't really able to record. So I'm here today, 2 weeks late. I am officially 30 now, so I'm like extra old. And we're going to just get right into it. So I hope that you are working on something cozy, something fun. If you're a crafter like me, I hope you have a cozy drink. If you are driving, please make sure that drink does not contain alcohol. I'm currently drinking a chocolate cold foam cold brew from Starbucks. It's delicious, and I needed the caffeine today, so I am very happy with my drink of choice. I hope you guys have something yummy as well. So today we're going to be talking about King Paimon through King Belial. If you hear any noises, as always, my 2 cats love to explore, one of which, Chai, my 7-year-old cat, is currently standing on top of my desk. So Lord only knows what's going to happen. This episode, we are going to have lots of fun and learn a lot about deities. Oh, sorry, there's some noise. We get to hear about Judas, who I will tell you is not anything what I was expecting. Isis, King Belial, King Paimon, and there was one more who I can't remember quite off the top of my head. Isis, Judas. There's an angel somewhere. Azrael. Archangel Azrael. Alright, so let's get started, because as always, you guys know I like to chat. Alright, let's get started. So the first entity that Sara speaks to this week is known as King Belial. King Paimon. Whoops. King Paimon is considered an infernal deity, or an infernal divine. So we have an idea of the infernal divine as wanting the worst for us for fun, and this doesn't really seem to be the case when we look at Sara and other demonolators. Well, she's not a demonolator, but if you look at Sara and you look at demonolators, demons just kind of have their own way of going about things, and they still want what's best for humanity, but they have their own way of going about it. She talks about the reason why she wanted to interview King Paimon was because of the movie Hereditary. And I have seen the movie Hereditary. Honestly, it didn't creep me out as much as it probably should have. This was a couple years ago, so don't ask me for details. I barely remember what I had for breakfast this morning. But I do know, like, it's all about, they call him Paimon, however you want to say it. But yeah, so she's like, I watched Hereditary, and I said, just like media on other divine beings we've seen, don't trust Hollywood's interpretation of things. Never ever trust Hollywood. Which is not to say that you can't enjoy a good scary movie, or a good, movie about ancient Egypt or whatever. Just take everything you see with a grain of salt. If you're curious about it, do not take Percy Jackson as fact. For example, please actually look into what, like, the actual history behind what you're learning about, because you cannot just take Hollywood or some random documentary you find online, which, to be fair, I love random documentaries I find online. But you can't just take those at face value. You have to actually, dig a little deeper. So King Paimon expects respect. You can't just go in guns blazing. So from the way that she describes him and the way she has him, the way she writes down her interpretations and the way she says she hears him speak in her head, he's very formal. I kind of get this picture of like an old style nobleman, right? Especially he's titled a king. So you have to, he's got this air of kingliness that you sometimes don't see with other divinities, and he speaks that way. But yeah, so he expects respect. You have to be, just like you have to be respectful of people that you come across, you need to be respectful of entities that you come across. Anyway, Sara mentions King Paimon's camel several times. And I literally wrote, because she talked about him like 2 or 3 times on page 211, and she says, it was a very nice camel at the bottom of page 211, and I wrote next to it in pink, I said, I want to meet King Paimon's camel, because just the way she keeps talking about him, I'm like, he sounds neat. Having met camels before, they can be downright ornery. Anyway. So he speaks really formally compared to the others. So I just love the way that she wrote him out. All right. So the first question that she asked was, what was the world like when you came into being? And basically there was a big war and humanity gained independence, even if we struggled to continue to struggle with the consequences of it. So yeah, he came into being kind of during a time of turmoil, essentially, is what I'm getting. And she asks, because a lot of infernal divine were originally angels, and so she asks him what kind of an angel he used to be, a power or a dominion, and he says he was a dominion. There's a quote on page 212. King Paimon was once a dominion of the 4th rank of angels who guide the lower ranks, keep creation in check, and bring wisdom down to humanity. We might say that King Paimon still does all of this, honestly, but as an infernal king rather than a heavenly soldier. So, and that's the thing about demons, and especially infernal divine, and especially this particular infernal divine, is they serve a purpose just like angels do. 2 sides, 1 coin. Which Sara talks about several times in her book. 2 sides, 1 coin. And the side that we're getting is, that we're understanding now, is they're teachers in their own way. Not just dominions, but Paimon definitely. King Paimon. All right, so she asks, question 3 was, where did you meet your camel? And his first thing, he says, was my dear dromedary. Yes, again, I love the way he speaks. So it was so the camel, apparently he called out for a steed, and the camel was the first to arrive. And it started out, like I said, I've met camels before. They can be downright rude and ornery. And apparently this camel started out that way, but they built trust. And I just think that's great that there's like an animal friendship story in meeting with an infernal divine. I think that's really fun. And just like Thor with his goats and Freya with her cats, I guess. So what interested you in arts and sciences? So that's really what his domain is. He's like the arts and sciences. And he says they're a way to overcome our weaknesses, but they're tools, not cure-alls. Page 213, there's a quote, "The world is created by art and is understood through science." I love that quote as someone who is a musician, someone who is a fiber artist, someone who loves learning about science and about the things behind the mysteries of the world. Like, it's so true. Like, art... So science tells us the facts, and then art helps us interpret them, is kind of how I take it. And the world is created by art. Everything is artistic. We live in a world where we express ourselves in myriad ways. Like I said, me with my music, other people with physical art, other people with, dance or literature. There's all these wonderful ways that you can express yourself, and we create... It's so funny that, if you are a Christian witch like I am, or if you believe in divinity, you have a belief that certain gods created the world. And then we get to be creators in our own right, and I think that's so cool. And then we get to understand what has been created through science. All right. What do you feel about being bound in Solomonic magic? Now, I think we've talked about this a couple weeks ago. Solomonic magic was basically like this ancient magic where people would essentially enslave the infernals. And it always turned out badly because when you enslave a divinity, that's only going to hold for so long. I think about Faustus. Great play. I did music, audio design for a play of it. Anyway, so it was used, according to him, by weak-willed people who wanted power and tried to control the infernal divine to get it. Being rude caused their actions to backfire. And I think he literally does say, let me see. There's a reason their wishes... This is on page 214. There's a reason their wishes backfire when they approach a demon like this, though they blame it on the fact that we are infernal beings and not the fact that they were rude. Yeah, he straight up says they were rude, which I think is... So many people are rude. Anyway, you can't be rude when you're talking to an entity that is bigger than you. Anyway, or you shouldn't be, I should say. Number 6, what do you think about your portrayal in Hereditary? And he said that the people involved, quote, ruin beauty. And on page 215, oh my gosh, my cats are making a ruckus. He says, they make us grotesque, undignified, simple monsters lusting after your bodies full of pus and blood and filth. Why? We're above this. And I have an answer, and I think it's because we're afraid of the unknown, and... Honestly, I think part of making ourselves less afraid of the unknown is making a mockery of the things that we are afraid of. So if we make this being grotesque and ugly and scary in kind of a caricature-like way, that kind of makes us less afraid of the real thing, I guess. Okay, so I have one cat inside the litter box, and I have another cat climbing on top of the litter box. Because he really wants to be her friend, and she really does not want to be his friend. Anyway, moving on. Okay, do demons actually care to possess people? So you see all these movies, The Exorcist, there's dozens of them, about people being possessed by demons. And I will say that I believe... Oh dear. I believe that there are true cases of possession, but I don't think it's so much that the demon wants to come in and wreak havoc on the world. I think it's more the demon sees an opening to have some fun and takes it. I don't know. Anyway. They don't need to, essentially. They don't need to possess people. Humanity is plenty capable of horrible things on our own. Just look at the world around us right now. Oh my gosh. These cats. Number 8. What inspires people to do evil things instead of good? Being stagnant. Being caught in the past. Being afraid to move forward. And there's another quote on page 216. You know I love my quotes. Where he says... it's a big quote, so let's do this. Humanity will endure great pain if it means they can avoid change. The pain of routine is more bearable than the fear of the unknown. Unknown breeds fear, fear breeds chaos, and chaos breeds evil. People's panic destroys their reason. They make up nonsense to justify clinging to old ways, even if those ways don't work. But eventually they can't bear that either, and all goes to hell. And then skip down a little bit. Humanity is pitiful at adapting gracefully. We do it, we just don't want to. And I think we have the capability of being much more graceful when it comes to adapting to new things. We just choose not to. Because we think we're the biggest and the smartest. And so we feel the world should fit our perspective, even when that's not necessarily the case. How do you see yourself? So she's getting into our last few questions. He forges his own path. He's not a follower. He's a king. He's in charge. And he truly believes himself to be, it's his way. If you want to reach out to him, you need to do things his way. All right. Okay, how do you want to be seen? And again, this goes into him being a king. He is a king and wants to be treated as such. He isn't here for our minor everyday problems. So you see several deities kind of in this later section where they're like, okay, don't come to us for every little thing. We're not necessarily here for your petty squabbles with someone who used to be your friend or whatever. Like you have your own power. I think people don't realize that just because we're not divine doesn't mean we don't have power. And so we expect our deities, our entities, our guides to get in the nitty-gritty with us when it comes to, things that really shouldn't even be, are below even us as humans. Petty squabbles, disputes, things like that. So if we want to deal with that, we need to remember that we have our own power. We don't need a divine being to step in at that just minuscule level. And on top of that, we can also use mundane things. We don't have to turn to magic for every single little thing. We exist as people. We have rational brains. We can think things through. We can have a conversation. We can talk. We can block. We can mute. We can ignore if we need to. We don't necessarily need to, I want this person to, I will admit, so a long time ago, 5 years ago in June, I had a car accident. This was long before I became a witch. Remember, I've only been a witch less than 2 years. But I was in a car accident. And I unwittingly, your word is a powerful tool. Before I even knew about, cursing and hexing and things like that, I cursed this dude. That was a silly curse. Because what happened was this guy, came in front of the car in front of me, caused 4-car pileup. He was fine and he ran away. I have no idea where he is. I have no idea who he is. I just hope that this curse worked a little bit. But I didn't call on any entities. I didn't say, okay, God, curse this person. All I said was, may the bottom of his right foot always itch. And that was all me. And I really, really hope that guy has a very itchy foot to this day. Because it was my right leg that got broken. But yeah, harmful as far as curses go. But again, still, it's not necessarily about wanting to hurt people to do something petty with a deity. You have your own power and you can use that power. Anyway, that was a tangent. I'm so good at those tangents. Anyway, Any last messages? And he says, we have to get out of our comfort zones if we want to grow. And that's what I've been doing as a witch for the past year and a half, is because when I grew up, I did not think being a witch was in my cards, because I grew up Christian and, I heard all the things. I've got a fun conversation going on my own personal Twitter where a person is telling me that I'm going to hell because I'm a witch, and it's whatever, but yeah, I used to believe that and I used to be terrified of it. I am no longer terrified of that, so it's fine. Okay. All right, my overall impression, he's an infernal being who is very royal and isn't around to deal with petty squabbles. I don't know if you could hear that, but Chai just growled at Wyvern because he got too close to her. Anyway, all right, Isis. Again, I've told you guys this before. I love the Kemetic pantheon. I love the Netjeru because of who I am related to, and my aunt's love of the Netjeru before she passed away, her worship of Best as her matron goddess. Anyway, so I'm going to start with a quote. All right, about who she is. So Sara talks about all these different names that the deities have. We actually know them by their Greek names more than anything. But I'm going to just call her Isis because that's what we as an English-speaking society know her as. Okay, so Isis too is known by a different name, Aset, A-S-A-E-T, A-S-E-T. She's the goddess of healing and magic, and one who in her lore went to collect the scattered pieces of her murdered husband after Set murdered him and revived him with the help of the goddess Nephthys. Okay. So yeah, the story is Osiris was killed and chopped up into tiny little pieces, and Isis went around and collected all those teeny tiny pieces, and with the help of Anubis created the first mummy, who was Osiris. Yeah. So, I'll get to it in a little bit. There's a podcast that is not related to witchcraft, but is still very cool that I highly recommend. We'll get there. Okay. So she was worshipped as far as England. So you have to remember that just because these are ancient deities doesn't mean they didn't travel. Especially because we have this wonderful, there was wonderful trade networks that were happening all throughout the ancient world. And you have to remember that, ancient Egypt was connected to Greece and Rome. And Rome conquered a majority of the known world at the time. So Rome would trade things throughout its entire empire, and so you had people from Egypt and religion from Egypt that would end up as far west as England. And I think that is so cool to think about, because we tend to think the majority of, so I don't remember where I learned this statistic from, and again, this is me rambling because I love to ramble. But there was I read a statistic somewhere that the average medieval person traveled no more than 30 miles from where they were born, because they didn't have horses or anything but their own 2 feet if you were a peasant. Now again, this is average, so we're not talking about people like royalty or merchants and things like that. We're talking about your average Joe farmer, because that's what most people were then. But we still had those other people, the merchants, the nobility, the religious leaders who did travel hundreds of miles, and it would take months, but they would travel from place to place, and they would spread those ideas around. I think that's so cool. Anyway, can you tell that I'm a history nerd? Because I can tell that I'm a history nerd right now. Anyway, so the first question her associations with, like, being a mother and magic and things like that. So Sara asks, did you always have your current associations? And she says, yes, most of them came from reviving Osiris, but others over time. So again, kind of like, I forget who it was. There was another goddess who was like, I've kind of been given a bunch of tasks that I didn't start out with. And I still do them, even though they weren't originally my job. And I think that Isis is kind of the same way. She's one of the most well-known goddesses in the world. Isis, I would put Hera, Athena, Persephone, the Morrigan. I would put all of those goddesses kind of the same, known across the world, even if you're not witchy in the slightest kind of thing. Maybe not the Morrigan, but especially Isis, Athena, Persephone, those people, because their stories are told over and over and over again. But yeah, so because of that, they kind of get roped into doing other things. And it from what I read in Isis's interview was that she doesn't really mind it. She wasn't like, I forget who the goddess was. It was another goddess who was kind of like, yeah, I don't really love doing these things, but I understand that it's my role, and so I do it. She's very much of the mindset of, yeah, this is my job now too. Cool, let's go for it. Anyway, number 2. How did you end up reconciling with Horus? Now, to understand this, it's not really explicitly written in the book, so I'm going to give you a little backstory, and this is where my recommendation for another podcast comes in. So, in my love of history, I listen to a lot of history podcasts, and there is a specific podcast called The History of Egypt, and it is History of Egypt podcast, and it's, I forget who. Yeah. Anyway, it's called The History of Egypt podcast, produced by Airwave History. I found it on Apple Music. I think it's also on Spotify. I'm not sure where else it might be, but I highly, highly recommend it. It's really good. It's really interesting. Very in-depth analysis of the different kings and queens of Egypt, with a little bit of the mythology thrown in. So that is where I'm getting my version of the story, is that podcast. So the story goes that while Osiris was still being glued back together, essentially, someone needed to rule the heavenly throne. And especially because once Osiris got back, he took over the underworld, so someone needed to rule the heavens. And he had a brother named Seth, or Set, and he had his son through Isis. Now, if you want to talk about what's the word? Not a virginal birth, but like a immaculate conception, where a woman gets pregnant without, doing the do. Horus is another example, an older example. So, Horus and Set go about having 3 different trials, and some of them are not work appropriate, so I'm not going to get into them. But the first trial, they're essentially having a duel, like a fighting duel, and Set at one point has the upper hand, and Isis becomes worried for her child. So essentially, she doesn't trust Horus's ability to pull through and win. And so she does magic, and I believe it becomes a draw. So they ended up having like 2 other contests. And eventually Horus comes out as the winner. But my point being that Isis, I keep wanting to call her Iris. Isis's interference caused that tension and that fight for the throne to become more prolonged. So, Sarah asks if she ended up reconciling with Horus. And she said it took time and her resolve, but eventually, yes, they did kind of mend their barriers. Okay. All right. So Sarah asks, what was it like having your worship travel so far? And she embraces her followers. She loves her followers. She seems very motherly, very open. I love this interview for that. And she embraces her followers near and far, though it took her a little longer for her blessings to reach a distance. So I think that's kind of interesting to think about, blessings taking more time the further away the person is, like from the physical location that a person is. And I think it depends kind of on the pantheon, because the Netjeru were very, very centered in Egypt themselves. And I mean, as far away as Nubia, but like the Netjeru were very, very tied to the physical location of Egypt. And in fact, the Abrahamic God, Adonai, was actually the same way for a very, very long time. In fact, if you look in the story of David at one point is exiled, and I might have told you guys this before too, but David is exiled from Israel. He can no longer be in the physical land of Israel. And he essentially says, why are you doing this to me? Now I can't worship God. Because the gods were tied to the land. Now that's no longer true, obviously, considering that Adonai is worshipped the world over. But originally, Adonai was specifically, and when I'm talking Adonai, I'm talking YHWH. Adonai was very much tied to a specific place. Because if you look at the Old Testament and you read it within the context and you understand the history, and you remember that El was originally the divine father, and Adonai was actually a son of El, one of 70. Adonai was tied to that specific country, and there were 69 other gods who were tied to 69 other locations. And of course that changed over time, but that's how it started. So anyway, apparently same thing with Egypt, very tied to the land. I am on a roll with a bunch of random tangents today. I love it. Okay, so number 4 was, what kind of nation was your favorite? And this does not surprise me at all, that she's basically like people or lands with knowledge and books, because she was very, like, magic was not just an everyday common thing in Egypt. Like, the priests and the king and the royalty were the ones who practiced magic. It was not something that common people had easy access to. So, again, when you get me started on Egypt, I love it. You needed to be, as a noble, you were expected to go to school, learn. Now, it's not like how we go to school nowadays, but you were expected to learn how to do certain things. And so you had to be educated to do magic. And so she loves these places that are filled with books and knowledge. And of course, she loves places with strong female royalty. So I think of Hatshepsut, I think of Cleopatra, I think of Catherine the Great, I think of Elizabeth I. Throughout history, I think of all these places where women have ruled and ruled successfully. Let's not talk about the way Cleopatra's life ended, but she did rule successfully for many, many years before that. Which, man, I'd love to get into that. But again, this is not that kind of podcast. This is not supposed to be a history podcast. Anyway. Alright, so Isis is the mother of Horus. Motherhood is a very important aspect of her, being. She's not like Hathor, who is like the mother goddess, but she is a goddess who is a mother. She said she's basically like, it's not about, well, I'll get there. my interpretation is it's self-sacrificing, putting your child's needs before your own. And the way good Lord, Isis, not Iris. Iris is a Greek deity. Isis is an Egyptian deity. Focus. Okay. So Isis says on page 223, motherhood is all about rallying your resources and people for the good of someone other than yourself. So again, it's not about you. There are a lot of people, and I'm not going to name names because it's a lot of people, but I think who think of motherhood as an accessory, like a child as an accessory. I'm having this child to make myself look better. It's what's expected of me, or this, that, and the other. And that's not what being a mother is about. It's about, raising a good human and about taking care of that human and their needs. I say that because I know people who are like that. What do you think about modern witchcraft? And magic doesn't make one all powerful. Again, we have this chai. Magic isn't this cure-all, you do it and then everything is right with the world kind of thing. But romanticizing the gods doesn't to make them more pleasant for modern audiences isn't helpful. Again, Hades and Persephone. Excuse me. Magic is more useful than just for material gain. I cannot read my handwriting, y'all. But magic has its uses, and it's not just meant for like money bowls and love and things like that. Like that's great. Like you can do money bowls and love spells within reason. I'm not one of those people who says don't do a love spell, but don't do a love spell without the consent of the other party. How about that? That will be my compromise. Don't do a love spell without getting the consent of the peoples that you are spelling. Okay. Speaking of, I need to do one of those because my husband and I are working on something. Anyway, but yeah, don't do love spells without permission. But my point being that there are so many different things that you can, do with magic, and it's not just meant for these tiny little squabbles. Just like King Paimon said, don't just use it for tiny things. Like, figure your life out for yourself first. Okay. What is the Kemetic underworld like? Again, so cool. And it's a place of growth and change, and a place to go to become whole. So she basically is like, you don't remain the same when you go to the Kemetic underworld. Like, you don't go there and stay Esther Dawn. You don't go there and stay yourself. Like, you become more. You understand things that you couldn't understand as a living human being. How do you see yourself? She makes difficult decisions and has learned from mistakes. We get that so many times in this book of people who have grown, learned, changed. Not people, entities who have grown and learned and changed. Okay, how do you want others want to be seen? And she's basically like, I made mistakes and they helped me grow, and I need that to reflect in how people see me. And I think that really comes down to, again, what happened with her and Horus during that altercation. I think it has something to do with that. Her last messages are communicate. Talk instead of spreading hatred. Lord, do we need that today? We have this whole system of people just being so hateful to each other because instead of listening to learn, we're listening to hear the end of the person's sentence so we can start speaking again. And I'm sure there's a much more elegant way to say that, but that's how a lot of listening, quote, goes anymore, is you're not listening to actually gain knowledge. You're listening so you can throw the next spear. All right, my overall impression of Isis. Of course, I already loved her because of just my special interests growing up and my aunt. But my overall impression is she's a goddess who loves knowledge and wants us to speak to each other more. Okay. So this next interview, especially if you are a Christo-pagan, Christian witch, I think is a lot and will kind of turn us on our heads a little bit. But if you are not a Christian witch or a Christo-pagan, I highly recommend you stick around, because it may give you some new perspectives on Christ and on, like, the religion as a whole, because Lord knows it did for me. Okay, so Judas, background, for those of you who may not know the biblical story very well, Judas was one of Jesus's 12 disciples. And he was the kind of like their treasurer. He was in charge of their funds, and he was the one who. By the way, I'm recording this on Palm Sunday, which is the week before Easter Sunday. So it's currently Holy Week. We have a Maundy Thursday service, which is like akin to Passover, I guess, kind of, not really, but essentially where the Last Supper was had, where Jesus and his disciples had Passover. And they, had their dinner. This is the part where Jesus says, "This is my body, this is my blood. Do these things in remembrance of me." Then we have Good Friday, which is the day that Jesus was crucified. And then we have Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Sunday, Jesus rose again. We have Easter. So we're kind of in, if you're like me and you're a choir director, we are in the throes of one of the busiest weeks of the Christian year. So Judas, during the Last Supper, Jesus tells Judas, "You are going to betray me." Judas, depending on the Apocrypha or whatever that you listen to, he was, possessed by a demon, or he had all these horrible plans, and he just left. And then he was encouraged by the Pharisees to give Jesus up to the soldiers. And so we get to the Garden of Gethsemane, which is a place where Jesus prays, and he's like, "I know this is coming. Take this cup away from me. I don't want to, I don't want to do this unless you need me to." And he's like, and in one version of the text, so I forget which gospel it's in, but he bleeds, like he just like sweats blood as he's doing this. And in the end, all of his people fall asleep, all of his apostles fall asleep, and Judas comes up to Jesus and kisses him on the cheek, and that's how the guards know which of the 12 to grab. Now, maybe 2 weeks ago I managed to not mention a musical, but we're back on it because I'm talking about Jesus Christ Superstar. So the story goes that Judas felt so guilty after what he did, that after betraying Jesus, that he hanged himself. Some authors think of Judas as trying to help. Apparently, according to the Book of God, the Bible is a novel by Walter Wangerin. Judas was trying to, make it so that Jesus had no choice but to reveal himself to the masses. I don't think, according to this, I don't think Judas realized that he was going to cause Jesus' death when he did this. Now, if you look at Jesus Christ Superstar, Judas was anxious about Jesus becoming this person. There's a whole... Okay, so story time. My dad used to listen to Jesus Christ Superstar in the car when I was very young. I grew up listening to it. I know all the words, all the different parts. I can sing the melody or the harmony in multiple songs. I love Jesus Christ Superstar. But in Jesus Christ Superstar, Judas is worried about the Jewish people if Jesus continues to essentially preach this radical idea that is counterintuitive to what is going on in Rome. So Rome is currently currently controls Israel. Israel is a vassal state, and so if you upset Rome, then bad things can happen to the Jewish people. And so in Jesus Christ Superstar, Judas is worried about what will happen to these other people if he does not turn Jesus in. And so there's this whole thing was, I don't want your money, I don't need your money, I just want everyone to be safe. And in the end, in Jesus Christ Superstar, he does hang himself. But anyway, so that's my perspective based on what I grew up consuming media-wise. So you could take it either way. Anyway, this is what Sara says. So the some authors. So Judas, when Sara goes in to do this interview, she actually meets him twice. She meets him once, and then she goes back later, and this is when she interviews him. The first time she sees him in a cell, like a jail cell, and he's essentially in a hell of his own making. He's paying penance. And for him, it feels as though no time has passed. He is, it's as though Jesus was just crucified in front of him. So, Sarah's first question is, what are you doing in this cell? And he basically feels like he needs to be able to forgive himself. So he's doing his own repentance. He's not necessarily expecting, hellfire and brimstone. He's not expecting someone to punish him, but he's punishing himself, essentially, so he can feel as though he is forgiven. And Sara, goes to talk to him, and Jesus is standing there with her, and doesn't talk, but essentially he's like, no, he needs to do this for himself. Don't stop him. So she asks him, why did you betray Jesus? And according to what she learned, he wanted people to see Jesus for who he was. He didn't intend for Jesus to die, and he hanged himself out of guilt. So Judas isolates himself. He isn't as knowledgeable about the world as most spirits, so she talks to him about things that other spirits are like, oh yeah, I've been around the block a million times or so. I understand this, we can talk about it. He does not do that. He's been in that cell for 2,000 years, essentially, punishing himself. So what do you think about the other apostles? And he was like, they became arrogant as followers of God and made up their own versions of what happened. So yeah, it is pretty much explicitly stated, or it wouldn't have made sense any other way, that none of the other apostles were there when he, offered to betray Jesus to the... my hands are up in the air. I am gesticulating wildly, and none of you guys can see it. But it would not make sense for one of the apostles to have been in the room, quote, the room where it happened, where Judas betrayed Jesus. Does not make sense. And none of them, according to the Gospels, none of them really talked to him afterwards before he went and hung himself. So they really have no specific way of knowing what actually happened. And so they made up their own things. Hi, Wyvern. They made up their own narrative of what happened when he betrayed Jesus. So no one really knows for sure what actually happened in that room. Anyways. Come on, buddy. You gonna come up? Okay. So what, thoughts on the Gnostic Gospel of Judas? So there's a gospel, that says Adonai is an inferior, weak God, which is very anti-Semitic. A lot of the Gnostic Gospels can be, because again, they have, like I said, they have this belief that God is inferior, and not the God of the Old Testament is different from the God of the New Testament, and the God of the Old Testament is not worth worshiping, which is why we have, a lot of anti-Semitism that's happened in the past 2,000 years or so. And Judas says, I didn't write that. I believe in Jesus, and I believe in Jesus' Father. I would not have written something like that. So, thoughts on being, what do you think of Jesus? And he was like, he tricked us. He tricked us with dying, but it was for the world's good. So he appreciates what happened. He understands why, and he understands why he did what he did. He's just, working through that. Okay. Number 6, thoughts on being connected to the Sicarii. So the Sicarii, according to Wikipedia and to Sara and to a couple other sources I read, the Sicarii are a group of Jewish zealots. So zealot being a specific term, not just necessarily someone who's very religious, who assassinated Roman forces in Judea, and that was according to Josephus. So they basically they were freedom fighters, and they were essentially and really some of the world's first assassins. They predate ninjas. They predate a couple other things, but so he understood their reasoning, and essentially they got labeled as terrorists. And Judas understood their reasoning again. So this is TikTok, so don't take it too seriously, but it's a really interesting thought. And it's historical. Of course, Passover was one of the biggest celebrations in Judea at the time. And so people would have celebrations, and during this time, because Judea was occupied by Rome would essentially have a parade of military might. Where whoever was in charge, so in this case it would be Pilate, perchance, would come with their armies and wear these elaborate robes and these elaborate, ride in on horses, which were very expensive, and just trying to show, like, just because you're worshiping your God does not mean that we're not in power, essentially. And he comes in from the west. And it's basically the exact opposite of what Jesus comes. Jesus comes in from the east. He's riding a donkey. He has no soldiers with him, only his apostles. And yet people are still crying, Hosanna, which basically means save us, to this man who has no weapons. It's an act of protest, at least according to this one guy whose name I don't remember on TikTok. Whether that's true or not, I think that's an amazing take to have. That it wasn't just necessarily because, he was fulfilling prophecy, but he was fulfilling prophecy you could say to spite the Romans and what the Romans were doing at that time. So I don't know how accurate that is. If someone would like to research that and reach out to me and tell me what their thoughts on it are, that would be amazing. So we've got Jesus coming in and, doing his thing, and especially as a protest to Rome. So Judas and all the other apostles, they were fighters in their own way for independence. And so Judas understands why they did it, but he doesn't appreciate how they went about it, because Jesus was not about violence. He was about peaceful protest. Turn the other cheek. The most he did was turn tables over and curse a fig tree. But he didn't hurt people in as much as he hurt inanimate things. Now, I won't get into the concept of animism here, but you know what I mean. So, how do you see yourself and want to be seen? So he's using this self-inflicted imprisonment to work through his guilt. So he feels guilty. He, just like sometimes if you have done something to harm another person and you know that you feel wrong, you kind of sit in that guilt for a long time. That's essentially what Judas is doing. Any last messages? Let change happen naturally. And there are 2 quotes on page 235. So let's see. Okay. All right, so the first one is, instead, seek opportunities to be the light, not opportunities to rip up the dark. And don't hide from mistakes. Embrace them, work through them, and walk back into the world when you are ready. And then... So Sara, now Sarah's talking, and she says, but after I posted this interview, while there was plenty of outpouring support for Judas, there was a comment that wasn't entirely unpredictable. One asking why anyone would sympathize with Judas, given that he sold Jesus out. And my answer was simple. When you can learn to sympathize with people, all people, and never deny someone their humanity, you find God. If a Christian can truly love their neighbor and their enemy, if they can even learn to love the devil himself, however they understand the devil, they can come a touch closer to understanding divine love and mercy. And I think that's amazing. Okay. So my overall impression, he's not what I expected. I expected him to be this arrogant, like you see him portrayed as like this sneaky, evil, conniving man, and that doesn't really seem to be the case. Now again, I can't verify this. I could go and I could, use my tarot cards and do the same thing. I might have a totally different experience because I feel like the spirits manifest in different ways for different people. But I am inclined to believe Sarah's interpretation of what she saw, because to me that makes much more sense for a man who had been following Jesus for years to want to, help him and, work harder and try to show other people what he has seen, even if he went about it in a not so great way, then I think it would be for Judas to just suddenly be this conniving person that he never was before. That's my personal opinion. So yeah, that was Judas. I really, really enjoyed that. So now we move on quickly to Archangel Azrael. Now this is going to be difficult for me because next week we're going to be talking about an infernal named Azazel. Azrael, Azazel. They're not the same person. So yeah. Anyway. So he is not in the Bible. They've entirely skipped over him in the Bible, but he is in several Jewish texts, including translations of the Book of Enoch and the Zohar. I have a copy of the Book of Enoch on my Amazon wish list. I have a ton of books on my Amazon wish list. I just dropped my phone. It's fine. I would love to, read all of them, but I've finished reading Where the Gods Left Off. I have finished reading it. So what I'm doing now is each week I go back and I kind of look over my highlights and my notes, and I put them down in like a talking points thing. So I'm not necessarily rereading the whole thing. I'm just getting snippets, right? But I've already moved on and started reading the next book. We will be reading From the Cauldron Born, which is by Christopher Hughes, and it is about Welsh witchcraft and Welsh mythology. It's very good. I'm very excited. But yeah, I just kind of wanted to let you know that that's kind of what's going on right now. Anyway, Archangel Azrael is not in the Bible. He's in Jewish texts. He's in the Book of Enoch and the Zohar. And he is an angel of death. So there are actually kind of two angels of death, but they serve different purposes. So he is the Grim Reaper, whereas Samael, who is a different deity, serves a different purpose within the realm of death. Anyway, so Sarah's first question was, why don't angels and deities of death like to talk? Because, like, she's had the one exception, I think, is Velis. But, like, she's interviewed several deities of death, and they're all kind of really quiet. And they don't have much to say. And essentially, the more that's said, the harder it is to get closure, especially when a living person is talking to a deity of the dead or an angel of death. You know, it's harder to, the more that these deities, these entities talk, the more that humans want to cling and try to get more information, and so it's harder to get closure if these entities in particular are very chatty. So her second question, which is a good question, how did Christianity miss the fact that you exist? And I feel like Christianity, as I say this, take this with a grain of salt. Christianity is a relatively modern religion in terms of the world at large, right? You have Chemeticism, you have Hellenic polytheism, you have Hindu. All of these religions outdate Christianity by a long shot, and so I think we kind of started to get a different view of death by the time Christianity rolled around, especially because we have this concept of, true life after death in modern Christianity. So the thought of an angel bringing death created cognitive dissonance, because in Christianity you have Jesus, who's the way, the truth, the life, right? If you follow Christian, again, I'm not trying to say this is the only way to believe. I'm trying to say this is what Christians believe and what I, to some extent, believe as a Christopagan. But not everyone believes that. But according to Christian belief, Jesus is the life. And there is life after death. Jesus has slain death, essentially. And so the idea that there is actually an angel of death when Jesus is supposed to have transcended death creates kind of a disconnect. And she essentially asks, what is the hardest part about... Oh, no, I skipped one. What's the difference between you and Samael? Samael is the other angel of death. Now, Samael was the deity who went through, or not the deity, the angel who went through killing the firstborn of Egypt. So his job was to actively take life, whereas Azrael's job is to collect the souls of the people who are already dead. So that's kind of the difference. So number 4, what's the hardest part about keeping the dead awake? So she asks, what's the hardest part about essentially being the hardest. So she meets Azrael in this kind of in between area, kind of a liminal space. And it's kind of this well-walked, kind of dim and dark place where there are these I can't help but compare them to zombies, these not quite awake beings following Azrael's lantern. And these are souls. These are people who are kind of in between life and death. And he says kind of the hardest part of doing that is keeping them awake. So I said it's imagery that makes me curious about the afterlife. They're chasing after Azrael's lamp. She asks, were you once the human Ezra? Because there's some confusion about that. And he says, no, he's death. He's eternal. Sara sees him as his true self, and he's got these many hands, and he's angels are weird, y'all. But yeah, he's not a human being. He's death. Death has existed as long as life has. And they walk in that dark tunnel, which is a part of death, so it's like you see the light at the end of the tunnel, that kind of thing. And Sara wonders if the souls that don't keep going are the people who don't see an afterlife after death. So she talks about the people who, like, I was clinically dead for so and so minutes, and all I saw was darkness. There was nothing. She wonders if that's kind of what's happening, is they haven't arrived somewhere yet. So what should people know about death? So death is a transition. So of course, being the nerd that I am, my first thought was death is only the beginning from Mummy. Tie-in. Anyway, but yeah, it's a transition. It's not necessarily the end. There are things that come after death. Lots of people, especially Christian witches, believe in reincarnation. Lots of religions believe in some form of reincarnation. It's a thing. So yeah, it's a transition point. It's a jumping off point. It's not necessarily the end. How do you see yourself? And he reminds people of the necessity of death and brings energy to push one forward, because you can just kind of sink into that guilt. Think of, oh gosh, what's the movie? I've only seen it once. Where there's the guy and he's pulling the horse out of the swamp, and he's like, the swamp of despair or something. I'm horrible. A swamp of despair, and the horse ends up dying. It's that kind of feeling where grief and sadness and despair and depression can weigh you down to the point of, wanting to just lay there in the dark once the lamp has gone away. And so it's Azrael's job to keep pushing you forward. And how do you want to be seen? So we are an infinite possibility. He is a beginning as much as an ending. So we are all infinite. Okay. So last messages. There's a quote on page 242. Faith for routine's sake is wasted, or is faith wasted? True connection to the divine in any capacity, whatever you call it, is lost when we follow tradition for tradition's sake. One must find their own connection and way forward with education, diligence, and sincerity. People must learn before they can act. So you can't just believe because it's comfortable or, expected. You have to believe because that's what you actually believe in. So you have to find your own path. You have to be willing to research. You have to be able to read 10 different, translations of whatever you're reading. And this does not just go for Christianity too, because I know that Christianity has a bad problem with being translated poorly. The Bible does. But I feel like you have to research. You have to be willing to learn. Because if you just stay stuck, you're never going to move forward. You're just going to be there. It's just comfortable. It's not growth. And let's see. Okay, there's another quote, same page. When people serve tradition rather than tradition serving people, it's time to retire it. And I think that's true of so many things outside of just religion. And I'm not going to get into that because I don't want to talk politics, but politics are definitely a place where that could apply. And then Sara's story. So she went to an Easter service with her mom, right? And in this Easter service, there were tons of people there because it's Easter. Easter is canonically one of the Christmas Eve and Easter are the two busiest services of the year. I can attest to that, though I'm not Catholic. And so she said she went there and, people were kind of going through the motions, but it just didn't feel right. It felt like everything was they were just doing that to be seen as good Christians. Not necessarily because they actually wanted to be faithful, but because they wanted others to perceive them as faithful. And I think we run into that a lot. Again, with the person that I've been discussing with on social media, this person's like, you're going to go to hell and this, that, and the other. I'm like, how does that further the kingdom? How does yelling Bible verses at someone and telling them they're going to burn eternally, how does that actually do anything? that isn't bringing people to whatever religion you're a part of. That is pushing people away. That is fear-mongering. That is not bringing people into the fold. And I don't think any deity wants to be believed in just because the alternative is eternal suffering. I just don't think that's true. So when you have people saying, well, you have to believe in such and such or you're going to burn, that drives me insane, because what God is so small that they can't handle being rejected, and will damn someone eternally from that. And I will tell you, it is not the Abrahamic God, the real Abrahamic God. It might be an egregore or a demiurge, but it is not the God of the Bible. Anyway, that's my rant on that as a Christopagan. Moving on. Okay, one more quote on page 242, talking about those people that she saw in church. The majority of these people weren't in there for God. They weren't in there for true belief in the story of Jesus, though they'd never tell you so. They were there for appearance, to go through the motions, to check it off their good person list for the day. And that is so true. Anyway, so my overall impression is that he knows his role and he helps people find their paths after death. He's not a deity or an entity of many words. He's just there to do his job. All right, our final interview for today is the interview with King Belial. So we get 2 infernal divinities in one podcast. So King Belial is another infernal divine. She says, quote on page 244 about King Belial, he was of the element of earth, that was known as that he was known as the lawless one, and that through the experience of many demonolators I'd come across, he seemed to be the ultimate destroyer of obstacles, a breaker of chains. So he's another divinity that Christians talk about being a breaker of chains, of course, is Jesus. So there's that kind of comparison almost. Okay, but I have to talk about the fact that, so traditionally, demonolators, the way that you connect to the infernal divine is you etch their sigil on a piece of metal, which can be rather expensive, and not everyone has the talent for etching things into metal. So what does Sara do? She carves his sigil into a potato. And I just love that. Sara has quite the personality. If you've never seen her, she has a YouTube where she talks about all sorts of things. She has like a podcast once a week, except unlike me, she actually shows her face and her bird. Her bird is great, and you should really check her out. But she has quite the personality. She's sarcastic and she's funny, and anyway, she's great. So if you like this book and you kind of like picking up what she's throwing down in terms of Christian witchcraft, she's written another book called Discovering Christian Witchcraft. It's great. We will talk about it at some point in the podcast. I've just got a lot of other books to get through. But yeah, she's great. Highly recommend. But she's funny and she makes me laugh, and that's part of why I enjoy her so much. Anyway, I actually wrote LOL in my notes here. Sara draws his sigil on a potato, LOL. So the first question is, so he comes in, and there's a very specific description of him in the Ars Goetia. So on 245, she says, King Belial himself looked nothing like what the Ars Goetia described him as, and I figured he wouldn't. Apparently, some believe he comes as two lovely angels on a chariot of fire, and maybe he did at one point, but here he was, a massive single figure, one with great metal armor, with horns rising from a bald head, and with eyes that burned a furious yellow. So she asks, why do you look different from your Ars Goetia description? And so essentially he changes to meet the expectations of those who see him. So like over time, people get this like, demons are beings are seductive beings that are supposed to draw you in. And so you get this picture of two angels, and then you kind of get the other extreme of, demons are these ugly humanoid but not human beasts, and so you get that, and then you get kind of an in-between where he's not necessarily this beautiful, tempting figure, and he's not this horrible, demonic creature. He's this powerful entity in his own right, who has a darker side to him. And so he kind of, over time, just like we change our hair and our clothes, right? I feel like if you're a divine entity, you just get to change you. I would like to change me. But I just think that's interesting. Anyway. So why are people afraid of infernals, she asks. And he is basically saying, people have trouble believing their own eyes if it contradicts what an authority figure has told them. So that essentially he's talking about people are told by authority figures all the time, and by movies and by books. I almost borrowed a book from I finally renewed my library card because I moved and I didn't have mail with my name and the new address on it that was certified, so I had to wait. But I finally have it, and I went to the library the other day and I renewed my card, and I was like, I might as well go look. I've never been in this particular library before because we have like 10 different branches, I think. And so I was wandering around, and of course I went to the very tiny witchcraft section. I live in the Midwest. I live in the Bible Belt. There's not going to be much in the way of witchcraft, but I did find a paranormal book, and it was about exorcism, about this former cop who helped with an exorcism, and I almost picked it up, but then I was like, do I really want to annoy myself with this right now? And the answer was no, so I put it back. But yeah, so you're told by all these different sources that demons are evil and ugly, and all they want is your soul, and they want to drag you to hell so you'll burn eternally, and this, that, and the other. But then when you see people who actually work with them, they're like, yeah, no, they're just kind of wanting to do their own thing, and they do it in a way that is different than the way angels do it, but they're still hoping for the greater good of humanity because they were created to want that. But yeah, so people, they have trouble reconciling what they've been told with what they're seeing as reality, and so they'd rather just go with what they're told. And I feel like we see that a lot with people with race or, disabilities or sexuality or gender. You've been told one specific thing, so when people negate that concept that you have in your brain, it just makes you dig your heels in harder. And it takes time to sort that out, and you have to be willing to look deeper to make yourself uncomfortable. And I feel like a lot of people in many situations just aren't comfortable with being uncomfortable. So, all right. He's the demon, patron demon of worthlessness and lawlessness. So she asks what these things mean to him, and he gives this response. This is a quote from page 246. Worthlessness is being cast away, he said. Being left to die. When people decide you're worthless, they leave your survival in your hands. Then when you do what you need to survive, they call you lawless. They claim you're breaking the rules if they cast you out of. Isn't that funny and stupid? So I say too, lawlessness is freedom and life, especially when you're abandoned. And I think that's crazy. I I think it's crazy in a good way. Like, we have, my first thought goes to the Wild West, because of course it does. Lawlessness. You're in the law. But yeah, so there's this concept of lawlessness as being this wrong thing, but technically, if you think about it, people who've been oppressed, who are fighting against their oppression, are lawless, are considered worthless by certain people in society. So I think that is a good, someone needs to protect those people, is what I'm trying to say, essentially. Anyway, what do the believer and the unbeliever have in common? This comes from a verse in 2 Corinthians that Sarah had been thinking about. And essentially he says, we're all tenacious. We try to make life meaningful in our own way, whether we have a higher power that we worship or not. We still are trying to make our lives meaningful. Unless you are like oh gosh, what's it called? I don't remember. I'm tired. Anyway, moving on. What kinds of things do you like to teach people? And we have to be willing to grab onto and fight for what we want. He essentially is telling us that if you want something done right, do it yourself. Don't be afraid of what so and such authority figure has in mind. That doesn't necessarily mean break the law. But if the law is inhumane, or, is specifically barring one group of people from existing, I hope you understand what I'm trying to say, then it's okay to be a little lawless. You have to go after what you want, what you need as a human being. Anyway. What do you think? She asks him the same question she asked King Paimon. What do you think about Solomonic magic? And he says it was for gaining power. More people nowadays are more interested in taking care of ourselves than for fame and glory, which is what people wanted back then. And I kind of agree with that assessment. I don't want to be famous. Doing this little podcast, I have about 5 or 6 people who listen to me weekly, and you know what? That's great. Cool, because I'm reaching those 5 or 6 people. Maybe those 5 or 6 people go and talk to someone else. Maybe they don't. But I know I'm reaching a group of people who really wants to be here. By the way, we are past 60 downloads now. So I'm pretty pleased with that. But I don't necessarily want to be famous. I don't want to be the one in charge of making decisions for a bunch of other people. I just want to live my life. And I want other people to be able to live their lives. I don't want fame. I just want comfort and being able to put food on my table and love, like easy things, right? And so the people who call on the infernal divine now are more interested in forming a relationship instead of just being demanding and controlling. Anyway. So he... how can people tell if you're nearby? On page 248, he says, or Sara says, then there was the feeling of something weighing me down, heavy to the point that I couldn't move. I figured he sent this feeling of heaviness, of chains, all that frustration with your current position, rage, and helplessness. When you feel those chains, he said, feel me nearby with a hammer. Which is just, like, the image that painted in my brain is really, really cool. Gave me goosebumps. So he opens blocked paths. He is someone who helps people who are stuck. So we had Azrael, who's like, I help people move forward, and I feel like in his own way, King Belial does the same thing. How do you see yourself? And he doesn't care about the world as long as his people are cared for. He specifically says, page 249, I don't care about the world. I care about me and mine. If this world goes to, brackets, poop, brackets, it's because you all let it get that far. But me and mine I take care of. I don't let mine fall apart. Not while they have their own dreams that need chasing. So he's very protective of the people he claims is his. Again, I edited that a little bit because I'm trying really hard to stay a non-explicit podcast. Again, this is not as you can hopefully tell by now, this is not a podcast for children, but it is still not a podcast that I want to put an explicit rating on. So, here we are. Okay. She asks him how he wants to be seen. He doesn't really care. And so his last messages are think before you speak and let rational thoughts prevail. So I think that's really similar to what Isis said, in that she wants people to talk more. And she wants people to have rational conversations and not, no, I'm right. No, I'm right. Like, she wants people, if you can't tell, I've had a lot of coffee. But they both want people to just act like rational people and have a conversation and think before you just spew whatever garbage you want to out of your mouth. Overall impression for me, he and other infernals have given me a new perspective on what demons are supposed to be like. Okay, so that was the end of what we are going to do today. Next week, we will be focusing on Azazel through Saint Nicholas. We are in the second half of the book, my friends. So, oh my gosh, kitties. We are getting into more of the infernal divine. There's still some other deities. She gets into her winter stuff, which is the High Priestess. Okay, that's a good card for this week. We're getting kind of into, like, there's fewer pagan deities and more, like, Christo-pagan kind of entities. There's still, like, she interviews Fra Berta. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. She interviews, my brain is fried and I don't know who I'm trying to say. The woman with the house with the chicken legs and the she was in Bartok's Adventures. Baba Yaga. Oh boy, that was a struggle. So she still interviews with some other really cool deities. So look forward to that. As always, if you want to reach out to me, you can find me on Twitter, Blue Sky, and TikTok, A Witch's Yarn. I'm there. Also, if you would like to email me, it's awitchesyarn@gmail.com. No apostrophes, no E's in witches. If you have any questions, I always love to hear from you. Our card of the week this week, since we have not had one in a little bit, is the High Priestess. So, according to my The Hobbit Tarot, because that's the one I've just kept at my desk, be guided by your intuition, secrets, deep feelings kept hidden. If this card is showing you, it says right now to get in touch with your deeper feelings, which you may have kept hidden from yourself for years. If it shows another, this person may well help you do just this. Okay. So, trust your gut. Listen to your intuition. I think that this is a very mystical card, personally. I mean, it's about a priestess. So I highly recommend that you take some time for meditation, for spending time in nature. If you live anywhere near where I live, it is a fantastic day, at least today, to go outside, sit in the sun, get your vitamin D, take a research book that you're working on right now, and go sit with the deities that you're trying to communicate with. This is a great day for it. So, again, I will see you next week. We will talk to Azazel, to St. Nicholas, and to a few other divine beings in between. Have a great week, and as always, don't explode. Goodbye.